Welcome to Books on Point. Nation on the Couch, Inside South Africa's Mind, explores life in our beloved country through the lens of psychoanalysis. By focusing on the idea of a political unconscious, it argues that there's so much to be learned from excavating the inner life of South Africans, which can illuminate the external problems that beset us from all sides. For more, we're joined by the author, Professor Wahbie. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Let's start off with what inspired you to write this book.
Well, Nastasia, I was very aware of the fact that as South Africans, we are inundated with commentaries on life in South Africa. And those commentaries typically come from a political angle, an economic angle, a sociological angle. But there are very few psychological commentaries on what's happening in South Africa. We often hear the phrase bandied about senseless violence, senseless as in we don't know what's going on. And so I thought to myself, it's an opportune time to try and make sense in psychological terms of what's going on in South Africa. And that's really what drove me to write this book.
Has a book like this ever been written before, or have you found that perhaps the profession tends to steer clear of, politics, etc.?
Indeed. Psychology has something of a reputation for being politically quite conservative and non-committal. And in fact, psychology in South Africa has, unfortunately, quite a bad reputation during the apartheid years. This, of course, is not a situation restricted to South African psychology. It's been noted about the discipline around the world. And of course, the world of psychotherapy also has been criticized for many years now for being indifferent, if not avoidant, when it comes to talking about political issues in the consulting room. I think the picture is changing somewhat if we think of developments in psychodynamic theory. But the mainstream, I would argue, remains politically quite removed, I think, from the everyday struggles of ordinary people.
On that note, then, as you mentioned in your first answer, we've looked at South Africa from a political point of view, from an economic point of view, and now we're taking South Africa, the nation, and we're putting it on the couch. As a doctor, as a professional, what kind of diagnosis can we put together for South Africa, given what you've researched, given what we know, and where the problems are? So what would you say is wrong, or perhaps we can fix with this particular patient?
That's such a great question, Nastasia. Let me put it this way. I think South Africa is undiagnosable in an official sense. I don't think there's a diagnosis for our country if you look at our diagnostic and statistical manual. But what I would say is this. The book makes the argument that if we're going to insist on a diagnosis, I would call it alienation. And by alienation, what I really mean is that South Africans just don't know how to engage with each other. We have relations of relationlessness with one another. Our relationships with each other are often perverse, where there are these power differentials involved, and we are unable to recognize our shared humanity. We're unable, or at least we struggle, to treat one another with dignity. And with respect. So in my view, in a diagnostic sense, the problem really lies in the way that South Africans relate to each other. And indeed, the book is really a book about violence in all its manifestations, whether one's talking about interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, symbolic violence like racism, structural violence like poverty and inequality. Violence is the question that this book really grapples with. And if one thinks about all those different types of violence, they really are about relationships and the perversity of relationships in South Africa.
For those who may not have a psychology background, how do they unpack or understand the idea of the unconscious? Where do you start?
Well, I suppose the best way to start is with Freud himself, where he had this iceberg metaphor of the human mind, where if one thinks of an iceberg, it's only the tip that is showing above the surface of the ocean. The vast majority of the iceberg mass is actually underwater and invisible. And that's exactly, from a psychoanalytic sense, how the human mind works. Our consciousness is extremely limited. It's just that little bit that we're aware of that sticks out above the water. But most of our mental activities are really completely outside of our awareness. They're underwater, they're buried, and they are not available to us easily. It's not easy to make sense of our unconscious lives. And what this book does is it tries to use psychoanalytic theory to excavate what it is that might be going on in the mental sort of underground of South Africa.
Right. On that note then, how easy or difficult was it for you to write a book in such a way that you're catering for everybody, whether you have a psychology background or perhaps one that is quite rudimentary?
It was difficult, Nastasia. It took me 5 years. The book was in my head for 5 years, and initially I was going to write it as a straight down the line academic text. But then I thought to myself, this is the kind of book that I think ordinary South Africans would very much be interested in. South African life is confusing for so many of us, and we're tired of all the economic and the political commentaries. So when writing the book, I had to be quite conscious about the audience. And the audience for me is ordinary South Africans who are curious about what's going on in South African life from a psychological perspective. So I really tried to make the book accessible in different kinds of ways, whether it was breaking down psychoanalytic terms, whether it was using examples from literature or from movies to make sense of psychological phenomena. That was very much an important consideration for me. And then, of course, my style to when I write is that I don't just want to write in order to be understood. I try to write in a way that I can't be misunderstood. And I hope that readers who engage with this book will get a clear sense of what it is that I'm trying to communicate. There's been a lot of feedback about the book from journalists, from ordinary South Africans, and at this point, it seems to me as if people are finding ways to relate to the contents of the book. So I'm very pleased to hear that for many readers that has been the experience.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. That is Professor Wahbie talking to us about his new book, Nation on the Couch.